Marcus! That's your boy, right? 7 years old?
The first thing Dale Pruitt said when he walked up to the window of Deja Carter's Honda Accord on Maplewood Road was not good evening. It was not license and registration. It was not even a proper sentence. It was a name. He said Marcus, and he said it the way you say a name when you want the person who loves that name to understand exactly what it costs them quietly, with a small pause before and after it, so it hangs in the rain like a threat with nowhere to go. He said, Marcus, that's your boy, right? 7 years old. And Deja Carter, who had spent 14 years as an ICU nurse learning how to keep her face completely still while her insides were coming apart, felt something move through her chest that had no clinical name she knew of. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific feeling of a mother who has just heard her child's name in the mouth of someone dangerous, and it is older than language and it does not negotiate. She did not scream. She did not cry. She looked at Dale Pruitt standing in the rain with his flashlight and his badge and the small, satisfied cruelty in his eyes, and she made a decision. What Pruitt did not know, what he could not have known, was that 31 seconds before he said that name, Deja's thumb had already found the record button on her phone without her eyes ever leaving his face. He did not know that 8 feet behind him, mounted at the roofline of a laundry business that had been on that corner for 19 years, a security camera with a red recording light had been watching everything since the moment his cruiser pulled to the shoulder. And he did not know that the call she was about to make in the next 4 minutes would activate a chain of events that could not be stopped, redirected, or buried by any amount of badge or bravado. Dale Pruitt thought he was the most dangerous thing on Maplewood Road that night. He was not even close. This story begins 4 hours earlier with a double shift. A little boy waiting on a floral couch and a man with a badge who had done this far too many times to too many people who had no one to call. Deja Carter was 34 years old, and she had built her life the way you build something when you know there is no safety net underneath you, which is to say, carefully, deliberately, and with the full understanding that one wrong step does not just cost you something, it costs you everything. She was an ICU nurse at Memorial Regional Hospital in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 12 years on the floor, and her hands showed it the way that hands always tell the truth about a person. Strong across the knuckles from the gloves and the constant washing but precise and light when they needed to be, the hands of someone who had learned that the difference between a patient stabilizing and a patient crashing could live in the quality of a single touch. Her 2014 Honda Accord had a scrape along the rear bumper from the hospital parking structure on the 3rd level, where the concrete pillar jutted out farther than it should, a scrape she had been meaning to get fixed for 4 months and kept finding neither the money nor the hour to deal with. In the back seat, her son Marcus's 2nd grade math workbook lay open to a page of addition problems that had been erased and reattempted so many times in certain spots that the paper had gone thin and slightly translucent, which told you something about the kind of boy Marcus was, not someone who gave up, just someone who kept trying until the eraser wore through. His Lightning McQueen backpack slouched against the door like a small, exhausted companion. These were the artifacts of her real life, the one that existed outside the fluorescent lights and the beeping monitors, and she loved them with a fierceness that could still surprise her sometimes when she noticed them. Marcus's father, Terrence, had been gone 3 years, a crane accident at a construction site outside Nashville. The company had settled quietly for a number that her attorney had told her was low and that she had accepted anyway because she did not have the energy left after the hospital and the grief and the single parenting to fight them on top of everything else. She had not had time to grieve the way grief is supposed to work the long dark passage of it because Marcus needed breakfast every morning and the mortgage needed paying every month, and there was no one else in the room to look at when things got hard. So she had kept going one shift at a time, one school morning at a time. Deja Carter did not have a safety net. She was the safety net, and she had made her peace with that. It was 11:52 p.m. on a Tuesday when she finally walked through the staff exit of Memorial Regional, the October air, cold enough to be a relief after 14 hours of recycled hospital warmth. Her feet ached in the specific deep way that only comes from standing on institutional tile. For that long, a radiating soreness that had moved from her heels up into her lower back sometime around hour 10 and had been making its presence known steadily ever since. Marcus was at Dorothy Hayes's house 2 blocks from their own place on Cedar Street, asleep on Dorothy's old floral couch with the television on low volume because the quiet made him nervous since his father died. Dorothy was 68 and warm-hearted in the specific way of women who have outlasted hard things and come through softer rather than harder, but she had high blood pressure that her doctor managed with medication that required her to be in bed before midnight, and Deja was already pressing the edge of that understanding tonight. She started the Accord and pulled out of the lot, doing the arithmetic in her head that she always did, the precise mental math of a single mother running on 12 hours of sleep spread across the last 48. If she arrived by midnight, Dorothy would be fine. If she arrived at 12:15, that was the 3rd time this month, and Dorothy would say nothing but would carry it. If she was later than 12:30, she needed to be prepared for a conversation she did not have the reserves for tonight. The clock on the dashboard read 11:54. She had 8 minutes. She was going to make 8 minutes. Oak Ridge sat in the shadow of Nashville the way a lot of mid-sized Tennessee cities sat close enough to feel the gravity of the larger place, but too far to benefit from its money, at least not in the neighborhoods that had been there the longest. The 3 East Side communities where black families had lived for 2 and 3 generations were the subject of a development proposal that had been working its way through City Council for the better part of a year. And the people who lived there understood what that kind of proposal typically meant for people like them, even when it was written in language that didn't say so directly. Officer Dale Pruitt had been with Oak Ridge PD for 14 years. He was not the department's best investigator or its most decorated officer. What he was productive, at least according to the numbers that Captain Frank Delaney reviewed at the end of each month, and Delaney had found that productivity useful enough over the years to make 6 formal complaints against Pruitt disappear into administrative review without resolution. Pruitt had a habit that was well known in the East Side neighborhoods. Though never entered into any official record, after 11 p.m., he patrolled the quarter-mile stretch of Maplewood Road between the shuttered textile factory and the Sunoco station, which was the route that hospital workers and warehouse employees drove home through after their late shifts. The people who used that route had learned to drive it with a particular care that had nothing to do with the road conditions. Tonight, Pruitt was 4 arrests short of his monthly number. Delaney had mentioned it that morning in the flat informational voice he used when something was not a request. Officer Kevin Walsh was in the passenger seat, 26 years old, and 7 months into a job that was teaching him one uncomfortable lesson at a time, that the academy and the reality of working under Dale Pruitt were 2 very different courses of study. Deja was doing 33 in a 35 zone when the lights came on behind her, and she knew before she could articulate why that this was not going to be the kind of stop that ends with a verbal warning and a "have a good night." The siren gave a single short burst, casual and almost bored in its authority, and that casualness was somehow harder to absorb than the full sound would have been because it told you the person using it was entirely comfortable. She pulled onto the shoulder near the old textile factory, which sat dark and massive against the night sky, and she did everything she had learned to do. Car in park, interior dome light on, window down despite the cold drizzle, both hands at 10 and 2, all 10 fingers spread and visible, which was not the behavior of someone who had something to hide, but of someone who understood that visibility was the difference between a bad night and an irreversible one. She watched in the side mirror as 2 figures stepped out of the cruiser. One stayed back. One came forward. Dale Pruitt walked with the weight of a man who had been told for a long time that he was in charge of things. Each step heavy, deliberate, the slow occupation of space by someone accustomed to owning it. He was 41, thick through the middle, and he carried the flashlight in his right hand and aimed it directly into Deja's eyes. Before he had finished approaching the window, a technique designed to disorient and which worked exactly as designed. He did not introduce himself. He did not say good evening. He said license and registration. Now, Deja said she was a nurse coming off a double shift at Memorial Regional, that she was on her way to pick up her son, that she had been watching her speed the whole way. She said it clearly and without defensiveness, the way she delivered information in the ICU directly, factually looking at the thing without flinching. Pruitt did not acknowledge a single word of it. He was scanning the back seat of her car with the flashlight beam, moving it slowly across the interior with the patience of someone who expects to find something and is willing to wait for it. Walsh stood 12 feet back beside the rear quarter panel of the Accord, his eyes directed at a fixed point somewhere to the left of the situation that required nothing of him. He was doing what Walsh had been doing for 7 months, which was making himself as invisible as possible inside his own uniform, and hoping the shift ended without forcing him to make a decision that would follow him home. Then Pruitt said he smelled marijuana. He said it with the flat declarative ease of a man stating a fact that has already been logged somewhere official, and he said it while looking not at her, but past her, into the back seat, as though the evidence he was about to need was simply a matter of looking in the right place. Sir Deja said, her voice holding steady. I have never smoked in my life. I work in an intensive care unit. My lungs have to be clean. Step out of the vehicle, Pruitt said, and did not look at her. Deja complied with every instruction, and she complied slowly and clearly and narrated each movement before she made it, because this was the protocol she had known since she was old enough to understand what protocol in this context meant. She said she was reaching for the door handle. She said she was stepping out. She said her feet were on the ground. Each statement was its own small act of survival, a way of removing ambiguity from a situation that had been designed to manufacture it. Standing in the rain, in her soaked nursing scrubs, hands on the cold, wet hood of her own car, the drizzle coming down steady and indifferent, she felt the specific humiliation of being required to perform innocence for an audience that had already rendered its verdict. The metal under her palms was cold in the way that October metal is cold, deep, and penetrating, and the smell of wet asphalt mixed with something chemical from the old factory across the road, and the blue strobe of the cruiser lights painted everything in repeating pulses of artificial color. Walsh opened her driver's door and began searching the interior. He went through the glove compartment and found the registration, a tire gauge, some takeout napkins, nothing. He looked in the back seat, and his hand rested for a moment on Marcus's Lightning McQueen backpack, and something passed through Walsh's face in that moment that was not quite guilt and not quite recognition, but was in the vicinity of both. Walsh searched for 4 minutes and found nothing. He came back to Pruitt and said it quietly. It's clean, Dale. There's nothing in there. Pruitt looked at Walsh for a moment. Then he looked at Deja. Then his eyes moved to her trunk. Pop it, he said. And he walked back toward his own cruiser, and he was gone for 44 seconds. Walsh stood where he was. Deja stood in the rain watching Pruitt's back, and she watched the angle of his body at his own vehicle, and she understood in her bones what was happening, even as her mind tried to argue that it wasn't that no one would actually do this, that the badge meant something, that the system had some floor below which it would not go. She looked up and to the left. On the corner of Maplewood and 5th Street, the laundry business that had been there for 19 years had a small amber light above its door, and at the roofline a security camera with a red indicator light that was on and steady. She had roughly 8 seconds before Pruitt turned around, and she used them the way she used everything, without waste. Her right hand went into the left breast pocket of her scrub top where her phone had been since she got in the car, and her thumb found the voice memo record button without looking at the screen, because she had pressed that button before in the parking lot of Memorial Regional one afternoon, 6 months ago, when some part of her had understood that a moment like this one might come, and it was better to know the motion than to need to find it in the dark. She pressed record. She did not look down at the phone. She looked up, and she looked directly into the camera at the roofline, and she held that look long enough to be certain she was in the frame, long enough for the light to catch her face, long enough for whatever was about to happen on a record that existed somewhere other than Dale Pruitt's version of events. She did not know whose camera it was. She did not know that the woman watching the live feed from inside that building had been waiting 18 months for exactly this kind of night. She only knew the light was red and she was standing underneath it, and that both of those facts might one day matter enormously to someone who needed them. Then, Pruitt turned around and he was walking back toward her car, and what was in his hand had not been there before. Pruitt opened Deja's trunk and spent 30 seconds moving things around with the practiced ease of a man who has done this before. And then he straightened up, holding a small clear evidence bag containing a quantity of white crystalline substance that had no business being there because it had not been there when Walsh looked, which was a fact Walsh knew and which sat in his chest like a stone he had not yet decided what to do with. Pruitt held the bag up under the flashlight and looked at it with an expression of theatrical discovery that might have fooled someone who had never seen it before. Then he looked at Deja with the flat, satisfied eyes of a predator who has cornered something and is taking his time about it. "Well," he said, "look at that." "That is not mine," Deja said, and her voice was steady in a way that cost her something real to maintain. "That was not in my car. Officer Walsh searched my car. He didn't find anything." "Walsh found what Walsh found," Pruitt said, and he said it without even looking at Walsh, as if Walsh's perception of events was a detail so minor it didn't require acknowledgement. Pruitt walked her through the consequences, the way someone reads a damage report methodically, without apparent emotion. Each item placed in sequence. DU. I charge possession. Charge mandatory notification to the State Board of Nursing. Automatic review of her professional license, likely suspension, pending investigation, timeline of 18 months to 2 years during which she would be unable to work in her current position. He let each of those land. He was good at this part. He had a feel for the moment when the weight of consequences reached its maximum compression, and that was when he said the name. Marcus Pruitt said, 7 years old, right? At Dorothy Hayes's house on Cedar Street. The world tilted. The rain kept falling and the lights kept strobing and the factory kept standing dark against the sky, and none of it reached Deja for a moment, because the only thing in the world was the sound of her son's name in this man's mouth. "You can't," she started. "I can call CPS right now," Pruitt said, and his voice dropped to a register that was almost conversational, which was somehow the worst version of it. "Emergency removal. Tonight. I tell them I've got an impaired driver, suspected narcotics, uncooperative. They put Marcus in a placement facility, could be 30 miles from here, could be more. Processing takes 48 to 72 hours minimum, could be longer depending on the weekend." He paused, and he let that image settle. Or he said, "We talk about what happens next." There is a feeling that comes when someone threatens the thing you love most in the world, and it lives in the body below the level of language, something older than thought. Deja felt her knees want to give, felt the pull of it, and she thought of Marcus's face in the early morning when he was still mostly asleep but would reach up and grip her shoulder with one hand, the specific trusting weight of that grip, the absolute faith of a 7-year-old who does not yet understand that the world contains men like the one standing in front of her right now. That weight did not break her. It became a different kind of solid. "I need to make a phone call," Deja said. "Not a lawyer. I need someone to go get Marcus so he's not left waiting if this runs long. You don't want a child abandonment issue on top of this stop." Pruitt looked at her. He calculated. Paperwork involving an abandoned minor was a complication he didn't need tonight. "Make it fast," he said. "Babysitter only. You call a lawyer, I take the phone, and we go straight to booking." Deja reached into her pocket and opened her contacts and found the name she had always kept first in her favorites list. Not because it came first alphabetically, but because she had put it there intentionally years ago for exactly the kind of night she had told herself might never come. The name said Ray. She pressed call. The phone rang twice. On the third ring, the line connected, and the voice on the other end was not groggy or slow. It was alert in the particular way of someone who does not fully sleep so much as rest at a reduced depth of readiness, a habit built over 20 years of being the person they called when the thing that was not supposed to happen was happening. Nia. He used her childhood nickname, the one nobody else used. Talk to me. Ray. Her voice broke on his name just slightly, the first fracture in the composure she had been holding for 32 minutes. I'm on Maplewood Road, near the old textile factory. Officer Dale Pruitt, Oak Ridge, PD. Cruiser number 44. He pulled me over. Walsh searched the car, found nothing, and then Pruitt went back to his own vehicle for 45 seconds and came back with a bag. He's talking about DUI and possession and CPS. He said Marcus's name, Ray. He knows where Marcus is. 3 seconds of silence. The specific silence of a man who has received information and is processing its implications with the speed and precision of someone who has spent decades making decisions in compressed time frames. Are you recording? Raymond said. She looked down at the pocket where her phone had been. Yes. Don't stop it. What's the timestamp on the stop? Do you know when his lights came on? 11:57, she said. I was watching the clock. Good. Don't volunteer anything else to him. 22 minutes. Then Pruitt finished his cigarette and crossed the distance in 4 steps and held out his hand, and Deja placed the phone in it, and Pruitt put it to his ear with the comfortable authority of a man who has interrupted a lot of phone calls over the years and found most of them unimpressive. Listen here, friend, Pruitt said. Your sister is in a world of trouble. Unless you're the Attorney General, I suggest you. He stopped. The change in his face happened in layers. The smirk went first, then the color, then the easy posture, each one departing like something that had been maintaining itself through effort and had just run out of the energy to keep doing it. He pulled the phone away from his ear for a moment and looked at the screen as if checking that what he was hearing was actually coming from this particular device. Then he put it back. I don't care what unit you say you're from, Pruitt said, but the authority in his voice had developed a crack in it, something structural. The sound of something that had been weight-bearing, discovering it might not be. He listened for another 12 seconds, and during those 12 seconds, Walsh watched his partner's face with the focused attention of a man watching a building decide whether or not it is going to fall. Then Pruitt handed the phone back to Deja. He didn't look at her when he did it. Your brother, Pruitt said, and his voice had gone flat and hard, the way voices go when they are trying to reconstitute authority from materials that are no longer fully cooperative, has a very big mouth. And big mouths don't carry weight on a county road at midnight. He reached for his handcuffs. The handcuffs went on too tight, deliberately. The ratchet clicking 2 notches past the point of restraint into the territory of statement, and Deja felt the metal compress against the thin bones of her wrists and said nothing, because saying something would give Pruitt what he wanted, and she was no longer interested in giving Dale Pruitt anything he wanted. The back seat of the cruiser was hard plastic and smelled of industrial cleaner and old fear, and the heater was running too hot, and the wire mesh between her and the front was close enough to feel like a cage rather than just look like one. She pressed her shoulder against the cold window and started building the timeline in her head the way she built patient histories in the ICU, organizing facts by sequence, noting every gap where there should have been information and wasn't. 11:54 when she left the hospital lot. 11:57 when the lights came on. 12 minutes of stop before Walsh reported the car clean. 44 seconds before Pruitt produced the bag. She went through it twice, then a third time, and by the 4th pass she had it tight enough that she could recite it in the dark without notes. Outside, Pruitt was pacing. The cigarette was gone. He kept glancing at the road in both directions, then at his watch, then at Walsh, who had moved to stand near the Accord and was doing nothing useful and nothing harmful, just standing in the rain in the specific posture of someone who is waiting for the shift to end. The Ford F-150 appeared on Maplewood from the direction of 5th Street, 21 minutes after the call ended, and it appeared without drama. No speed, no announcement, no urgency in the approach. It simply arrived and pulled to the shoulder behind the cruiser. The way a vehicle arrives when the person driving it has already decided everything they need to decide about the situation and is now merely present to execute. Raymond Carter stepped out into the rain, and the rain started immediately soaking his dark shirt and the collar of his jacket, and he gave no indication that this was relevant information. He was 46, 6 feet 1, with gray at his temples, and a face that had been refined rather than hardened by the things it had seen, not the brutality of a face that has been forced into bluntness, but the precision of a face that has learned to do more with less. He was wearing jeans and a plain shirt, the clothes of a man's neighbor or a man's brother, which was accurate. He scanned the scene in the time it takes most people to process that there is a scene to scan. Pruitt stepped into his path before Raymond had covered half the distance to the cruiser. "Sir, this is an active traffic stop. I need you to return to your vehicle." Raymond stopped at exactly 8 feet from Pruitt. Not 9, not 6. 8, the distance of a conversation between adults who are not yet adversaries and may not need to become them. He looked at Pruitt with eyes that were dark and intelligent and entirely without aggression, which was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. "Officer Pruitt," Raymond said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had given orders in rooms where the stakes of being misunderstood were measured in human lives. It carried without effort. "My name is Raymond Carter. I need to speak with you about the person you have in custody." Raymond reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with the slow, deliberate visibility of someone who has learned that speed in this kind of context is almost always a miscalculation, and he produced a hard-sided identification holder and opened it and held it out toward Pruitt at an angle that made it readable without requiring Pruitt to step closer. The card was navy blue with a federal seal in gold. It identified Raymond Carter as a special legal advisor to the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. Pruitt looked at the card. He looked at it for a beat longer than a man looks at something he has immediately categorized. "That's a civilian advisory position," Pruitt said. "That doesn't give you authority over a county traffic stop." "You're correct," Raymond said, and he agreed so readily that it briefly confused Pruitt. "I'm not here in an enforcement capacity tonight. I'm here because the person in the back of your car is my sister, and because 19 minutes ago I called the FBI field office in Nashville and reported this incident as a potential civil rights matter involving a federal contractor." Walsh, standing near the Accord, looked up. Federal contractor Pruitt repeated. "My sister works under a service contract with the VA hospital system," Raymond said. "The VA is a federal facility. That classification has implications for how this arrest is reviewed. I'm not telling you that to threaten you, Officer Pruitt. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into." Pruitt laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has heard variations of this approach before. "You're bluffing. Your sister's a nurse at a county hospital, and you're a government pencil pusher. And right now she's in my custody on a possession charge. So unless you have something that actually changes that, I have something that actually changes that," Raymond said. "Your body camera," Raymond said. And he said it without particular emphasis, the way you refer to something that is simply part of the landscape. "Officer Pruitt, what time did your body camera deactivate tonight?" A pause. "Equipment malfunction," Pruitt said. "It happens." "It does happen," Raymond agreed. "When it happens, it gets logged in real time by dispatch." "What time was the malfunction logged?" Pruitt said nothing. "Because the reason I ask," Raymond continued, his voice carrying the measured, precise quality of someone who has spent years building arguments in writing and knows exactly which stones to place, in which order, "is that if the camera malfunctioned after you initiated the stop, that's one thing. If it malfunctioned before you initiated the stop, before you had any documented reason to follow a vehicle, that's a different conversation entirely. And that conversation involves premeditation rather than equipment failure, which changes the legal character of everything that happened after it." Walsh had moved unconsciously 2 steps closer to Raymond's side of the road. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain my equipment to a civilian." "No," Raymond said. You'll explain it to the supervisory special agent who's going to request that log first thing tomorrow morning. I just thought you might want to think about what that log shows before then." Raymond turned to Walsh with the same unhurried directness he had used with Pruitt, but the texture of it was different in a way that Walsh, who was a perceptive person underneath all the learned compliance, immediately felt. Raymond addressed him by name, by title, formally, and with complete respect, as if Walsh were a full participant in this situation rather than a peripheral one. "Officer Walsh," Raymond said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it clearly so there's no ambiguity about what I'm requesting. In your professional capacity as a law enforcement officer currently on duty at this incident, did you observe Officer Pruitt approach his own vehicle at any point between completing your search of the suspect vehicle and the discovery of the alleged contraband?" Walsh looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's head moved in a motion so small it was barely there. A lateral shake, almost imperceptible, the kind of signal that has been refined through years of use into something that looks like nothing to anyone who isn't meant to receive it. Walsh looked back at Raymond. Raymond did not push. He did not lean forward. He simply waited with the stillness of someone who has learned that waiting is one of the most powerful things a person can do in a charged situation because it puts the weight of the silence entirely on the other person. Officer Walsh Raymond said, his voice dropping just enough that only Walsh could hear it clearly. "You are the only person standing on this road right now who hasn't done anything that can't be undone. What you say in the next 30 seconds is going to determine whether that remains true." Walsh closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them. "I didn't have a clear line of sight," Walsh said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. "But I observed Officer Pruitt approach his own vehicle for approximately 40 to 45 seconds between the time I completed the search of the suspect's car and reported it clean and the time he opened the suspect vehicle's trunk. It was not a confession and not a formal accusation. It was a fact stated by a sworn officer currently on duty in the presence of a federal official, and it meant that the 44 seconds now existed in a record that could not be edited." "Thank you, Officer Walsh," Raymond said, and he said it simply without ceremony. Pruitt turned to Walsh with an expression that was not quite fury and not quite disbelief, but existed in the space where those two things have a collision. "Walsh, he asked me a direct question," Walsh said, and he looked at Pruitt for the first time that night without looking away. "I gave him a direct answer. That's all I did." The light inside the laundry business on the corner of Maplewood and 5th came on, and the front door opened, and Donna Reeves walked out carrying a laptop computer, moving with the deliberate, unhurried stride of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment for a long time and is not going to waste it now that it has arrived. She was 55, with a face shaped by 19 years of running a small business on a corner that the city had tried to rezone twice and that had survived both attempts through a combination of legal tenacity and community stubbornness. She stopped in front of Raymond and opened the laptop and turned the screen toward him. The footage was high definition and the camera angle was exactly right. It showed the full stretch of shoulder where the stop had occurred from the moment Pruitt's cruiser pulled up to the present. It showed Walsh searching Deja's vehicle. It showed Pruitt walking back to his own cruiser and spending 44 seconds there with his body angled in a way that obscured what his hands were doing. It showed him walk back to Deja's car. It showed the trunk open. "My name is Donna Reeves," she said to Raymond, and then she looked at Pruitt with an expression that contained the entire weight of 18 months of waiting. "I put this camera up after your officer arrested my nephew Deshaun on this same stretch of road 2 years ago. Deshaun Webb, 21 years old, possession charge. He didn't have anything in his car either. The charge cost him a scholarship to Tennessee State." Pruitt said nothing. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession and had arrived at something that looked like calculation. "I've been recording this corner every night since," Donna said. Waiting. Raymond stood in the rain and looked at the laptop screen, and he thought about the recording running in Deja's phone, which Pruitt had handed back without checking, and he thought about Walsh's statement, which was now part of a conversation with a DOJ official and therefore part of a record. And he thought about the footage on Donna's screen, which was time-stamped and continuous and showed everything in sequence. 3 independent records, 3 streams that corroborated the same sequence of events from 3 different angles. Not one witness saying one thing. 3 sources of documentation saying the same thing without having coordinated with each other, which was the kind of evidential structure that does not fall apart under pressure because it was never dependent on any single point. Raymond took out his phone and called the number he had dialed 19 minutes ago. And when the supervisory special agent picked up, Raymond said, "The evidence is documented and corroborated from 3 independent sources. I'm ready for you to send someone out. We also have a secondary victim, Deshaun Webb, Tennessee, state scholarship 2 years ago. Same officer, same stretch of road. You'll want to pull that file." He ended the call. He looked at Pruitt. "This is not going away," Raymond said, and he said it without heat, the way you tell someone the weather. "I want you to understand that before we take any next steps." Captain Frank Delaney's personal vehicle, a detail worth noting since responding to a call in a personal vehicle at midnight suggests a desire to manage a situation before it acquires official documentation, arrived 8 minutes after Raymond made his call. Delaney was 53 and broad through the shoulders and carried the settled authority of a man who has spent 2 decades being the person other people called to make things disappear. And he had made things disappear for Dale Pruitt 6 separate times over 14 years. He looked at Raymond the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately classify. "I don't know who you are," Delaney said, "but you are interfering with a lawful arrest, and I will have you removed from this scene." "Captain Delaney," Raymond said, "I've read the internal affairs file on Officer Pruitt. 6 complaints over 14 years, all administratively closed by the same reviewing officer. I notice you hold that reviewing authority." Delaney's chin came up. "Those cases were reviewed and resolved appropriately." "That's one characterization," Raymond said. "The Department of Justice has a different one, and we've had it for about 11 months. This stop tonight didn't create our interest in this situation, Captain. It just gave us something we didn't have before. And what's that clean, time-stamped, corroborated record of how Officer Pruitt operates when he believes no one is watching?" Raymond walked Delaney through it the way he had built arguments for 20 years, not as an attack, but as a structure, each piece placed in its correct position so the whole thing became visible. "The body camera deactivated before the stop was initiated," Raymond said. "The equipment log will show the exact timestamp, and that timestamp will show premeditation rather than malfunction. Officer Walsh searched the vehicle and reported it clean. Officer Pruitt then returned to his own vehicle for 44 seconds, a gap that is documented on private security footage from the corner business, before opening the suspect vehicle's trunk and producing contraband. The chain of custody on that evidence is broken before it was ever established." Delaney said nothing. The audio recording from my sister's phone, Raymond continued, captures Officer Pruitt by name, making specific threats regarding Child Protective Services, using her minor son's name and current location as leverage. Under Title 18, Section 242, the use of law enforcement authority to coerce compliance through threats to a person's family constitutes deprivation of rights under color of law. That is not a misdemeanor. That is a federal charge with a mandatory minimum. He stopped and looked at Delaney directly. "You can continue this arrest tonight. That is your authority, and I'm not disputing it. But I need you to understand that every decision made from this point forward is documented, and those documents will be reviewed by people who have been building a file on this precinct for nearly a year. What you do in the next 5 minutes is going to be part of that file." Delaney stood in the rain and looked at the road and looked at his officer kneeling in the mud of his own making, and he did the arithmetic of his own situation. It did not take long. The arithmetic of a man calculating how much of himself he can still save is always faster than any other kind. Walsh walked away from the Accord and toward the gathering near Pruitt's cruiser, and he did not look at Pruitt when he did it. He stopped in front of Delaney. Captain Walsh said, "I need to make a formal statement right now in the presence of the federal advisor." "I want it documented tonight," Walsh Delaney said, and his voice carried the specific tone of a warning that has not yet become a threat. "Think carefully." "I've been thinking carefully for 3 weeks," Walsh said. "Since 7th Street, you know the stop I'm talking about. Antoine Davis coming off his restaurant shift. I was there. I watched Dale go to the trunk, and I didn't see what went in the trunk, but I saw what came out of his vest pocket before we got to the trunk. And I went home and I didn't sleep, and I've been not sleeping for 22 days because I kept telling myself I didn't have enough to say anything. Tonight, I have enough." The silence that followed was the silence of something structural giving way. Pruitt's composure, which had been managing itself through the encounter through sheer force of habit, broke. What came out of him in the following 30 seconds was the genuine voice of Dale Pruitt, without the professional coding, and it was loud, and it contained specific language that the audio recording in Deja's pocket captured cleanly, and it confirmed to everyone standing on that road the exact kind of man they had been dealing with. Raymond said nothing during those 30 seconds. He let it happen. Some people construct their own cases more effectively than any prosecutor could manage. An FBI vehicle had turned onto Maplewood from 5th Street and was rolling slowly toward them with its headlights on. "Remove the handcuffs from Ms. Carter," Delaney said, and he said it to Walsh, not to Pruitt, because the architecture of this situation had already changed in ways that made that distinction meaningful. Walsh went to the cruiser and opened the back door and helped Deja step out. And Raymond was there before Walsh finished the motion, one hand steady under her elbow, as her legs found the ground and they stood facing each other under the rain. Raymond looked at her wrists where the marks from the too tight cuffs were already visible as dark impressions against her skin. He looked at them for exactly the length of time it took to understand what they meant and file that understanding somewhere precise and permanent. Then he looked at her face. "The recording," Deja said. "Still running." She checked the screen. 43 minutes and 17 seconds of audio, still running. "Good," he said. "We're going to need every second of it." She looked at him, and something in her that had been held at maximum tension since 11:57 p.m. released not all at once, but in layers, like a structure carefully being allowed to decompress. "You got here," she said. "I told you 22 minutes," he said. "It was 21. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a breath and a sound she didn't have a name for. Then she straightened her back and turned to look at Pruitt, who was standing in the rain watching the FBI agent approach, and she said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the recording, "My name is Deja Carter. I am a registered nurse. I was stopped at 11:57 p.m. on Maplewood Road while traveling under the speed limit. I did not resist. I did not threaten. I did not do anything except exist on a public road while driving home to my son. And I want that in the record." Raymond looked at her with something in his eyes that was too quiet to be called pride, but was in the same family as pride, and he nodded once. The FBI agent's name was Carver, and he worked with the specific efficient quietness of someone whose professional value lies entirely in not making situations larger than they need to be. He took Pruitt's weapon and badge in a sequence of procedural steps that were so orderly they were almost peaceful, and he read Pruitt his rights in the flat informational voice of someone for whom this is simply a task that requires accurate execution. Pruitt sat in the back of the federal vehicle and looked out the window at Maplewood Road, and what was visible in his face was not defiance and not remorse, but the look of a man who is doing arithmetic and not liking the numbers. 14 years, 6 buried complaints, a drop kit in the trunk. Walsh's statement, 44 seconds of footage. A DOJ advisor who had apparently been building a file for 11 months before this particular Tuesday night provided the piece that made everything else usable. The karma of it lived not in any dramatic reversal, but in the absolute ordinariness of the mechanism, the forms being filled out, the log entries being time-stamped, the chain of custody being established with exactly the procedural care that Pruitt had always bypassed when it was inconvenient for him. Captain Delaney got back into his personal vehicle and drove away. He was told not to leave the city. He was not yet in handcuffs, which he understood was a temporary condition. Walsh sat in the front seat of Carver's vehicle with a legal pad on the dashboard and gave his account in the careful, measured sentences of a person who has rehearsed telling this truth in their head many times and is finally saying it aloud. He described the 44 seconds. He described the sequence in the order it happened without interpretation, placing each fact in its correct position in the timeline. Then he described the night on 7th Street with Antoine Davis, and he described it in full, and his hand shook throughout, but his voice held. When he finished, Carver asked whether Walsh would be willing to serve as a government witness. Walsh said yes before Carver had finished the sentence. One more thing Walsh said when Carver was closing the legal pad. Deshaun Webb, Donna Reeves's nephew. 2 years ago, this same stretch of road. I wasn't there for that one, but I heard about it afterward, and the way Dale talked about it in the break room, I knew. I knew what had happened, and I said nothing because I wasn't there, and I told myself that meant I couldn't do anything. But I could have done something. I should have. Carver wrote it down without comment. Walsh looked out the windshield at the road. Raymond drove, and Deja sat in the passenger seat with her feet up on the dash the way she had done since she was 12 years old, and neither of them spoke for the first few minutes, which was the right call because there was a kind of silence between two people who grew up together that doesn't require filling. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. The street lights of Oak Ridge drifted past the east side neighborhoods dark and quiet at this hour, a dog crossing someone's yard, a single lit window somewhere on Cedar Street. The city looked exactly as it had looked at 11:54 p.m. when she left the hospital. But something had shifted in it, or in her, or in the way those two things related to each other, and she could feel it, without being able to name it precisely. Raymond reached into the center console without taking his eyes off the road and produced a small bottle of water, and he handed it to her, and she pressed the cool plastic against the mark on her left wrist where the cuff had been tightest and held it there, and it helped a little. Dorothy opened the front door before Raymond's truck had fully stopped because Dorothy Hayes did not miss much that happened within a 2-block radius of her house, and she had been awake and watching out the front window since 12:30. Marcus was on her shoulder in the specific position of a child who has been asleep and is now 3/4 awake and confused about which of the two states is currently in effect, his face soft and slack, one small hand fisted in the fabric of Dorothy's housecoat. When the truck door opened and Deja came up the walk, Marcus came fully awake all at once the way children do, and he reached for her before Dorothy had finished turning toward the door, and Deja took him, and he wrapped himself around her neck and buried his face against her shoulder, and she stood on Dorothy's front step in the drizzle and held her son with both arms and breathed him in the irreducible particular smell of her child, the weight of his trust, the absolute specific reality of him. Dorothy caught Deja's eye over Marcus's head and asked with just her face whether everything was all right. Deja nodded. Dorothy looked at Raymond, who was standing by the truck, and then she went inside and closed the door gently to give them the porch. Raymond stood in the driveway and watched his sister hold her son, and his face, which had been composed and deliberate and entirely controlled from the moment he stepped onto Maplewood Road, did what it did in the specific presence of the people he loved, which was go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with distance. The federal courtroom in Nashville smelled of wood polish and recycled air, and the specific stillness of a place where things happen that cannot be undone. And it was nothing like the shoulder of Maplewood Road, except in one essential way what happened here would also be on a record, and the record would last. The gallery was nearly full. People from Oak Ridge's east side neighborhoods had driven 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning and in some cases taken personal days to be here, which was a different kind of commitment than the courtroom acknowledged, but was real and significant to the people making it. In the front row of the gallery sat Marcus Webb, 23, with the particular stillness of a face that has learned not to give things away freely. And beside him sat Donna Reeves, who had not spoken to him in the weeks before the trial because they were both witnesses and were following the rules exactly, and who was sitting beside him now because she had decided that the rules had been followed enough. Deja sat in the second row in a simple navy dress, and she sat straight, and she watched the front of the room with the steady attention of a woman who has been waiting 4 months for this particular morning. Dale Pruitt had lost 20 pounds in 4 months, and the suit his attorney had chosen for him was intended to communicate diminishment and ordinariness, and it had achieved ordinariness. He walked to the stand without looking at the gallery, and he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth with the practiced steadiness of a man who has performed that oath many times and understands it as a formality. His direct examination built a careful structure, years of service commendation, record the difficult reality of late-night patrols, the genuine perceptual challenges of making judgment calls in poor visibility and bad weather. His attorney guided him through it with the skill of someone who understands that a jury responds to narrative, and the narrative was of a man who had done his best in a difficult job and made a judgment call that was now being second-guessed. "Officer Pruitt," his attorney said, "did you know at the time of the stop that Ms. Carter was a nurse? I did not." Pruitt said, "Did you know she had a child? I did not. Did you intend any harm to Ms. Carter or her family?" "Absolutely not," Pruitt said, and his voice carried the sincerity of a man who has repeated this particular sentence enough times that it has acquired for him the feeling of truth. He did not look at the gallery. He had not looked at the gallery since he entered the room. The federal prosecutor was a woman named Claire Okafor, 38, and she began her cross-examination the way she always began it, which was with the kind of simple administrative question that sounds like it comes from a different conversation entirely, but is in fact the first stone in an arch that is already complete. "Officer Pruitt," she said, "at what time does the equipment log show your body? Camera was deactivated on the evening of October 14th. Pruitt said he wasn't certain of the exact time that logs were maintained by the technical unit. Okafor submitted the equipment log as Exhibit A and read from it. The camera had been deactivated at 11:49 p.m. The stop of Deja Carter's vehicle had been initiated at 11:57 p.m. The camera had been turned off 3 minutes and 48 seconds before Pruitt had any documented reason to follow any vehicle. So, your camera, Okafor said, was off before you had observed any driving behavior that gave you cause for the stop. Equipment malfunctions don't follow a schedule, Pruitt said. They don't. Okafor agreed, but malfunctions get reported to dispatch in real time. Can you tell the jury what time the malfunction was reported? Pruitt said he would need to consult the records. The records show no malfunction report filed for Unit 44 on the night of October 14th. Okafor said, which means either the malfunction wasn't reported, which is a policy violation, or the camera wasn't malfunctioning. Pruitt's attorney said, "Objection. Counsel is testifying." The judge said, "Overruled. The witness may answer." Pruitt said nothing. The silence occupied the room for 4 full seconds. Okafor moved to the second exhibit, the private security footage from Donna's camera, and she played 12 seconds of it on the courtroom monitor, Pruitt walking to his own cruiser, the angle of his body, the 44 seconds, the return to Deja's trunk. Officer Pruitt. Officer Walsh had already searched the suspect vehicle and reported it clean. Can you explain what you were doing at your own vehicle for 44 seconds before you opened the suspect's trunk? I told you, my citation book. And retrieving a citation book from a vehicle typically takes 44 seconds. No answer. Then Okafor placed a small recorder on the rail in front of the jury box and she pressed play, and Pruitt's voice came into the room unmistakable, flat, conversational, and it said, "Marcus. 7 years old, right? At Dorothy Hayes' house on Cedar Street." And then it said, "Emergency removal." And then it said, 30 miles from here, could be more. The room was completely silent. Not the disciplined silence of a courtroom following protocol, but the spontaneous silence of people who have heard something that has temporarily stopped them. A woman 2 rows behind Deja exhaled slowly through her nose, a sound almost like a word. The judge did not call for order. He let the room be what it needed to be for the 30 seconds it needed to be it. Kevin Walsh took the stand in plain clothes because he was no longer Officer Walsh. He had submitted his resignation 7 days after the night on Maplewood Road, and he had filed it in writing with a single sentence of explanation. I cannot in good conscience continue in this role while the matters I have witnessed remain unresolved. He had kept a copy of that letter. Okafor walked him through the evening of October 14th, and Walsh gave his account with the unhurried precision of someone who has organized what they need to say around what is actually true, which is a more difficult structure to maintain than organizing around what is convenient but considerably more durable. He described the search. He described finding nothing. He described Pruitt's 44 seconds at the cruiser. He was asked whether he had seen Pruitt place anything in his hand during those 44 seconds, and he said he had not had a clear line of sight, and he said this without apology because it was the accurate answer. Then Okafor asked about 7th Street. Walsh looked at the jury, and he described Antoine Davis, 23 restaurant worker waiting on the sidewalk for a ride, and he described what he saw come out of Pruitt's vest pocket before they reached the trunk of Antoine's car, and he described going home afterward and what that was like. I went home, Walsh said, and I told myself I didn't have enough to say anything. I told myself that for 22 days. And the thing about that story is that it's technically true I didn't have documentation, but it's not the real reason I didn't say anything. The real reason I didn't say anything is that I was afraid of what saying something would cost me. And I chose my own comfort over the truth, and a man I had never met paid for that choice. The courtroom was quiet. At the front of the gallery, Marcus Webb Deshawn's friend, another name on the list of young men whose lives had been redirected by Dale Pruitt's drop kit, lowered his head and pressed his hands together in his lap, and Donna Reeves beside him placed one hand over both of his and left it there. Mr. Walsh, Pruitt's attorney, said on cross, "Isn't it true that you were offered a significant reduction in your own legal exposure in exchange for your testimony?" "I wasn't facing legal exposure," Walsh said. "I hadn't done anything illegal. The government asked me to tell the truth, which is what I'm doing." There was no deal. The attorney sat down. The arch that Pruitt had been building toward a reasonable doubt had just had its keystone removed. Donna Reeves testified for 22 minutes, and she was precise and unembellished and looked directly at the jury throughout, and she explained the camera and its history and the night she had mounted it and why. She submitted the full footage from October 14th into evidence, and it was played in its entirety. Not the 12 seconds Okafor had shown in cross-examination, but the complete 43 minutes from the moment the cruiser's lights came on behind Deja's Honda to the moment Raymond's Ford F-15 pulled onto the shoulder. Ms. Reeves Okafor said your nephew, Deshawn Webb. He's not in this courtroom today. "Can you tell the jury why Deshawn has night classes?" Donna said. "He's in an electrical engineering program at Nashville Community College. He couldn't take the time off." She said it without additional comment, and the jury heard what she had not said, which was that Deshawn had not been able to take the time because every hour he could find to study was an hour he was using to rebuild something that had been knocked down by the same man they were judging today. Deja Carter walked to the stand and settled into the chair and looked at the jury the way she had looked at families in the ICU when she needed them to hear something true that was going to be hard to hear directly without performance giving them the respect of the unvarnished version. She testified about the stop. She testified about the search. She testified about the 44 seconds from her perspective, which was that she had watched Pruitt's back as he stood at his own vehicle, and she had understood in her body what was about to happen before she could have explained how she knew. She testified about the recording, about pressing the button, about looking up at the camera, about making the choices available to her while standing in the rain with her hands on the hood of her own car. Then she looked at the jury and she said, "I want to tell you what Officer Pruitt took from me. Not the 43 minutes on that road, and not the recording, and not the case. I'll give all of that. I want to tell you about the drive home. I have driven home from Memorial Regional Hospital at midnight on this same route for 9 years. I have driven it tired, and I have driven it worried, and I have driven it in the rain and in the dark, and in all of that time, it was just a road. It was the road between my job and my son, and I was never afraid of it." She paused. "After that night, I am afraid of it every single time. I am a nurse. I walk into rooms where people are dying, and I am not afraid because I know what I'm doing there, and I know why I'm there. But I am afraid of the road home to my son. And Officer Pruitt didn't take that from me because he arrested me, or because he made a judgment call in difficult conditions. He took it because he looked at a woman driving at the legal speed limit in a safe vehicle on a public road, and he saw something he decided he had the right to destroy, and he had a badge and a drop kit and a plan, and the plan would have worked. It had worked before if I hadn't pressed one button and looked up at one camera. She looked at Pruitt for the first time during her testimony directly and without flinching. "You thought I was alone on that road," she said. "I need you to know that I was not." The silence that followed lasted long enough that the judge eventually said, "Thank you, Ms. Carter," in a voice that had shed some of its judicial neutrality. Judge Patricia Owens did not require extended deliberation to establish her position because her position was visible in the quality of her attention throughout the trial, focused, undeflected, and completely unreachable by the various rhetorical approaches Pruitt's attorney had attempted. She looked at Pruitt over her reading glasses with an expression that contained no anger, which was in some ways more final than anger, because anger implies that there is still something personal at stake, and her expression implied that what was at stake here was simply the record. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "in 14 years, you were entrusted with something that most people in this country still believe in, despite significant evidence that their belief is sometimes misplaced. You were trusted with authority over other people's freedom. You used that trust to build a private enterprise of cruelty, refined over years until it ran with the efficiency of something that had been practiced many times. You did not lose your temper. You did not make a judgment call in a difficult moment. You drove to a stretch of road where you knew people would be alone and vulnerable, and you brought a bag to make sure you would find what you needed to find." She picked up the sentencing document. "For deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and making false statements to federal investigators, 18 years in a federal correctional facility. No early release provisions apply under the applicable statutes." The gavel came down. Pruitt did not collapse and did not weep. He sat in the chair for a moment after the sentence was read, very still, and then he stood when the marshals approached, and he turned and walked toward the side door, and as he walked, he passed the row of the gallery where the East Side community of Oak Ridge had been sitting for 3 hours, and he did not look at any of them, and none of them looked away. At the door, he looked back. Not at Deja. He looked at Walsh, who was standing near the exit. Walsh met his eyes and held them and did not look away, and that was the last thing Dale Pruitt saw before the holding area door closed behind him. For Captain Frank Delaney, the separate proceedings were scheduled for the following spring. He had resigned his position 2 weeks after the October 14th incident, taking early retirement, which had not stopped the indictment, but had perhaps been intended to. For Deshaun Webb, his criminal record had been expunged the week the investigation opened 4 months ago. The scholarship to Tennessee State had already gone to someone else and could not be retrieved. A foundation in Nashville, after the story reached regional and then national coverage, had contacted Donna Reeves and offered Deshaun a replacement grant, which he had accepted, and which was paying for the night program he was in now. For Marcus Webb, not Deshaun, a different Marcus, 23, and quiet. And sitting in the front row today, the clearing of his record had restored his name on paper. What paper could not restore was the 2 years he had spent believing that the law was simply a tool that the powerful used against people like him, which was a belief that Deja Carter's one button and one upward glance had cracked open slightly enough to let something else in. The October afternoon sun in Nashville came in at the low angle of a season that is winding down, and it caught the courthouse steps in a way that made the stone look warmer than it was, and Deja stood in it for a moment without going anywhere, just letting the light be on her face. Donna Reeves came through the doors behind her, and they stood together without speaking, in the way of two women who have been through something together, and have arrived at the point on the other side where the thing no longer requires constant acknowledgement. Then Donna said, "You know why I put that camera up. Not just because of Deshaun, Because I knew if something happened again it would be my word, and my word alone wasn't going to be enough. I needed the camera to make my word matter. I knew that too, Deja said. When I looked up at it, I didn't know it was yours. I just knew I needed something outside myself to make what I was seeing real to someone who wasn't there. Donna nodded. She said Deshawn had called her last Sunday, which he hadn't been doing regularly for a while, and that he'd sounded more like the person he'd been before. Not all the way back. Some things don't go all the way back, but more like himself than he'd been in 2 years. Deja took out a business card, the one with her direct line rather than the hospital's general number, and she held it out to Donna. If Deshawn or anyone in your family needs anything at VA, any service, any referral, any appointment that isn't moving fast enough, you call me directly, not the main desk. Me. Donna took the card and looked at it. Then she looked at Deja. You going to be all right? I'm going to be better than all right, Deja said. I'm going to be informed. Raymond was at the bottom of the courthouse steps, phone in hand, finishing a call, and when Deja reached him, he was sliding the phone into his jacket pocket with the small, efficient motion of a man closing one thing and opening his attention to the next. You have to go, she said. Tomorrow morning. Atlanta. She straightened his collar, the reflex of 30 years of being his sister, and he let her do it the way he always had without comment. She said, When I called you that night, you asked me one question before anything else. You asked if I was recording. Not are you hurt, not where exactly, not who's there. Recording. I knew you would have thought of it, he said. You think ahead. You always have. I thought of it because I was terrified, and I understood that terrified wasn't going to be enough on its own. That's not being terrified, Raymond said. That's being smart while you're terrified. Those are different things, and most people can only manage one of them at a time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There are people on Maplewood Road every night who don't have a brother to call. People who pressed record and didn't have the camera, or didn't press record at all because they didn't know to. And I keep thinking about what happens to them. Raymond looked at her with the steady, serious attention he gave to things that mattered. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to figure that out, she said. But I think it starts Thursday. Thursday, New Hope Baptist. There's a community rights meeting. I photographed the flyer. He nodded once slowly, the nod of someone who recognizes a decision that has already been made. He hugged her brief and firm, and complete the hug of a man who means the ones he gives. And then he walked down the steps and got in the F-150 and drove south toward the highway. She watched the truck until it was gone. Marcus came out of the after-school program at 5:15 with his backpack bouncing and 3 things he needed to tell her simultaneously, all of them urgent, all of them operating at the full volume available to a 7-year-old who has been storing up news since morning. And Deja caught him and swung him, and let the weight of him reset something in her chest that had been wound tight for 4 months. In the car, he was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. And then in the abrupt way that children transition between subjects when something has been sitting in their minds, waiting for an opportunity, he said, Mom, how come Uncle Ray knows so much about the law? Deja thought about the right way to answer this for a moment watching the road, and then she said, Because Uncle Ray saw a lot of things in his life that weren't fair. And instead of just being angry about them, he decided to learn how to fix them. He went back to school when most people think it's too late to go back to school, and he learned the words that matter in the rooms where things get decided. Marcus thought about this with the concentrated seriousness he brought to things that interested him. Do you know those words? She looked at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were watching her with the absolute open faith of a child who has not yet learned to expect disappointment from the people he loves. I'm learning them, she said. I'm going to a meeting Thursday about it. Can I come? It's a grown-up meeting. Oh, a pause. Will you tell me what they said after? Every word she said. She turned onto Maplewood Road and she drove it at 33 miles per hour in a 35 zone, the same as always. The textile factory stood dark on the left, the same as always. The Sunoco ahead, the laundry business on the corner, the amber light above the door steady in the early evening. The camera at Donna's roofline had its red light on, as it always did after dark now, and Deja glanced at it as she passed, not with fear and not with gratitude exactly, but with the recognition of one person for another who has decided to pay attention. On the telephone pole just below the camera, in a clear plastic sleeve so the rain wouldn't dissolve, it was the flyer for Thursday's meeting at New Hope Baptist. She had photographed it 12 days ago. She had been looking at the photo most nights since. She drove the last 3 blocks home without the arithmetic running in her head for the first time in 4 months, and when she pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, she sat for a moment in the quiet of her own car and noticed that the road home felt like what it had always been before October 14th. Just a road, just the distance between her job and her son. She got out and Marcus was already running for the front door, digging in his backpack for his key, shouting something about whether there was still cereal, because he wanted cereal, not dinner. And she watched him and laughed, and the laugh surprised her with how much of her it used. Dale Pruitt walked through the intake processing of a federal correctional facility on a Wednesday morning that the facility's calendar noted as unremarkable. No ceremony accompanied it, and no cameras. The gate engaged behind him with the same mechanical sound as every gate in that place, which was also the same sound he had made with his handcuffs on Maplewood Road and on 7th Street, and in a dozen other locations across 14 years of deciding who got to keep their life and who didn't. On the corner of Maplewood and 5th in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Donna Reeves's laundry business opened at 8 a.m. that same Wednesday morning. The amber light above the door came on. The camera at the roofline showed its red light, steady and patient, watching the road the way it had been watching it for 18 months. And on Thursday evening at New Hope Baptist Church, 3 blocks from Maplewood, the folding chairs that the deacon had set up for the community rights information meeting, 40 of them, which seemed like more than enough, were gone by 6:50 p.m., and the deacon was in the storage room looking for more. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps our channel reach the people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment that hit you hardest? We read every single one of them.